So this is a time for sort of planning emergency measures. In the developing country context, there are a set of really important things that need to be done. Some of them can be done by some countries on their own, and some of them require external help. Ideally, with this very rapid outflow of capital from the developing countries to shore up the balance sheets in the advanced countries, what one would want is to reverse those capital flows on a temporary basis. That is essentially what the IMF is for. The IMF does not have sufficient resources to do that on a global basis, and they also, because of past history, have sort of a credibility problem. The countries with very large reserves, foreign reserves, can use those reserves to reverse those capital flows and to partially alleviate or take a step in the direction of alleviating the credit tightening that goes with it. There's virtually nothing that a developing country can do about the decline in global demand. What everybody wants to have happen is that there would be a clear commitment to not resorting to protectionism as of dealing with domestic sort of demand issues or declining production. And that was a clear statement in the November meeting of the G20, but there's some evidence that protectionism in various forms is growing. So that commitment, particularly from the advanced countries, is important. The other thing is that to the extent that a country can, it needs to try to engage in fiscal stimulus, which amounts to substituting domestic demand, meaning expanded domestic demand, for the lost foreign demand. It's not possible to do that completely in any country, but countries that have the fiscal capacity to do it without running risks in terms of government debt or deficits need to try to do it. Those that don't have reserves and don't have the fiscal capacity or the domestic economy that's big enough to take up the slack from the lost global demand really need external help. The other thing that developing countries will want to focus on is something that came up in the context of the commodity price shock that sort of hit us in the past sort of year and then went away suddenly because of the financial and economic crisis, is that those price sort of volatility effects very adversely affect the poor. I mean, it was extremely clear in the case of food that the poor people were adversely affected to the point of being on the verge of starvation. And in many developing countries, there were not pre-built transfer mechanisms, either transfers of food or transfers of cash or conditional transfers of something that were in place that provided a mechanism for sort of helping the poor out. And those mechanisms, in the future need to be built. What happened in a number of countries, because those mechanisms weren't built, is that the government was forced, and this is understandable, to resort to alternatives such as price controls, or in a couple of cases, a number of cases, export controls, with the obvious intent of keeping the cost of these things down, but at great expense, both to the government and to the supply side. I mean, the right answer to this is when you have high prices, to let the supply side respond. And in many developing countries, high commodity prices are, in the long run, an opportunity if the supply response can come rather than a problem, even though the short-run issue is a distributional problem associated with the fact that the adverse effect lands particularly heavily on the poor. So this, this is a tall order. I mean, you have to deal with the distributional impacts. You have to deal with the credit tightening, which involves reversing the outbound capital flows and then turning them into credit available to small businesses, medium-sized businesses, all kinds of businesses. And then you have to try, to the extent possible, to stimulate the domestic economy to tide you over as the external demand it declines. And hopefully the external demand won't decline as a result of protectionism, in addition to the fact that it's just plain going down. And all of these effects are big. There are what you might call first-order effects on the economy. There are a number of issues that one could ask. I think that the work that all of you are involved in, which is determining where the most vulnerable people are and how adequate the mechanisms are for delivering relief to them, is extremely important. How much of that can be effectively done or deployed in the context of the current crisis, that you would know. But it is important even in the current crisis, but it's also important going forward. I don't think, we don't know how this crisis is going to come out, and that is whether it'll be a full-blown depression or just an extremely bad global recession of the type that we haven't seen for, I don't know, since before World War II. But it's also important in the long run. It's part of the infrastructure that a country needs in order to handle a relatively risky, volatile external environment, which I think is a way we have to describe the global economy, and deal with the distributional impacts of that kind of volatility. If one is unable to deal with them, then two things happen. One, you get a kind of moral and ethical problem. Second, it's very hard to sustain the growth-oriented policies if there's no viable mechanism to protect people. They'll vote in one way or another with their feet in the streets and so on against the openness that is associated with high growth and participation in the global economy. So I think that work is very important.